thanks everyone for joining my PhD defense today. My dissertation title is Efficient Modeling of Multi-Legged Locomotion with Slipping. So here we use multi-legged to refer to robots or animals with 6 or more legs. When multi-legged systems work, they usually have 3 or more points of contact, so they have better stability than bipedal or quadrupedal robots. This makes the control problem much easier because they don't need active control to maintain balance. Also, they could even use less motors. For Atlas, it has 20 degrees of freedom for the whole body and 6 DOF per leg. For the quadruped, it has 3 DOF per leg with 12 motors in total. On the other hand, for this Rex robot and Big Ant robot, both of them use 1 DOF legs. So they only use 6 actuators for the whole body. So they could be much cheaper in terms of the cost and have the same mobility in traversing rough terrain. So they could be potentially used for search and rescue missions or delivery, etc. Furthermore, most people think that multi-legged robots should be in centimeter sizes as multi-legged arthropods. However, fossil evidence showed that 300 million years ago, there existed giant millipedes that have 2 to 3 meters long. The reason that they are much larger than modern arthropods, partially because the high concentration of oxygen level in the atmosphere at that time. Since robot doesn't depend on respiration for power, they don't need to have that size limitation as biological insects. So as an example, the robots in the second column, inspired from cockroaches and ants, are meter-sized. In multi-legged animal and robot studies, slipping has an important role here. For example, both millipedes and cockroaches exhibit a substantial amount of slipping in their movement. In the robot experiment, they also slip, and in fact, for this Big Ant robot with 1 DOF legs, due to its kinematic constraint, it cannot turn without slipping. So having a model of multi-legged system could help the scientists and engineers to better understand the dynamics, be more efficient in designing controllers and having autonomous multi-legged robots. However, when dealing with slipping, the legs are no longer constrained to the ground. It could be in stance, flight, or sliding. The model complexity could suffer from exponential explosion with more legs. So the objective of this thesis is to find an efficient way of modeling multi-legged locomotion together with slipping. Specifically, given how the foot movement in the body frame, we would like to predict how the body moves in the world frame together with the supporting and propulsion forces on each leg. So this presentation is structured as following. I will start with background, prior work, and some motivating example in multi-legged modeling. In the second part, I will talk about our proposed model construction and some experimental validations. In the third part, I will show how to set up the robot with force torque sensors and its calibration. Finally, I will show some preliminary results on extending and applying this model for applications. Let's get started with the background. Let me first introduce the geometric mechanics model. It partitions the robot configuration space in body position and internal shape. It says a Lagrangian system can be reformulated into these equations by symmetry reduction. For example, we could think of the symmetry comes from a homogeneous environment where the governing equation should be the same regardless of the robot's position. By doing this reduction, excuse me. By doing this reduction, it allows us to write the body velocity in terms of the shape-changing velocity together with this generalized momentum term. When inertia dissipates quickly, the momentum term goes to 0, and body velocity is linear in terms of the shape-changing velocity. This A of R here is called local connection, and this form is called principally kinematic. This model is commonly used in modeling snake behavior, for example, Purcell swimmer under viscous drag or snake swimming in sand or wheeled snake robot. Previous work from our group showed that multi-legged locomotion together with slipping also obey the principally kinematic locomotion together with slipping. The authors of this work constructed this local connection AFR term from experimental measurements on both ants and big ant robot. So based on that observation, my previous lab mate Dan Zhao first attempted to construct this local connection model through a simple spring-supported model. I will explain this model in detail later, but the essence here is that we use a special friction assumption that the friction is a combination of Coulomb and viscous friction, where it scales bilinear in terms of the supporting force and sliding velocity. Then this equation gives the local connection form. So with this assumption, even though it contradicts our intuition of the friction should be dry Coulomb friction between the foot and the ground, the predicted body velocity matches very well with the experimental measurements. So to understand why does that work, let's look at this one-dimensional example. Suppose we have m feet, and each foot move at some speed relative to the body. The world frame velocity of the foot is simply adding the body velocity v of b to it. In Coulomb friction, the force is dependent on the normal force and the direction of the sliding. And in viscous friction is linear in terms of the sliding velocity. At force balance, assuming all the supporting forces are ones, the Coulomb friction solution for the body velocity is the median, whereas the viscous friction solution is the mean. So that's where the linearity comes from in the previous slide. The binary direction in 1D becomes an angle in 2D. The Coulomb friction now depends on the sliding velocity divided by its norm. It causes a singularity problem when a foot gets closer to the static friction. So in the plot, we show a squared robot with 4 feet on the corners with an arrow represents its foot velocity in the body frame. And on the left, we plot the total force contour acting at the robot body at velocities varying along x and y direction without rotating. The singularity problem caused by Coulomb friction are denoted by these dots. On the lower plot, we're showing the viscous Coulomb friction model gives a simple quadratic contour, and both models produce very similar results as shown by the red stars. Then we shift gear a little bit and analyze this inchworm crawling model. The model is inspired from mass shifting during locomotion, like tripod gait on cockroaches, snake motion, or snake or inchworm motion. In the model, we have 2-point masses with an actuator that have a finite stroke length in the middle. The larger mass represents the set of legs that's bearing the heavier load, and the smaller mass represents the others. The system periodically extend or contract and switching masses from one side to another to generate motion. We want to ask what is the actuation force to produce locomotion at a certain speed. So the result of this model shows that the steady-state velocity is in fact linear in terms of the actuation force in the parameter range that's similar to the capacity of our robots or, say, small animals like rabbits. The green and purple sets of lines are 2 sets of parameters. And for each set of parameters, there are 2 motion regimes where the actuation force is large enough to pull the larger mass out of the friction cone, or it's not. This shows that a system governed by Coulomb friction can exhibit viscous behavior on average, and it could partially explain why that viscous Coulomb friction model could work. So in summary, in this section, we talked about multi-legged locomotion can be modeled through local connection. Viscous Coulomb assumption gives that local connection form. Coulomb friction gives very similar results to viscous Coulomb friction, but it suffers from singularity problems. And the inchworm crowding model shows an average viscous behavior under Coulomb friction sliding. So next, I will discuss the multi-legged locomotion model construction. The model takes in the feet position and velocity in body frame and outputs the body orientation and velocity in world frame together with the 3D contacting forces on each foot. We model each leg with a spring that connecting the chassis to the point of the contact. My previous lab mate Dan worked on this model and had some preliminary results in his thesis. He assumed the robot had zero pitch and roll with negligible pitch, roll, and z velocities, and the robot is at force torque balance. He observed that during turning motion, there's an error on the turning radius that needs to be corrected by adding an offset. That offset needs to be characterized through experiments. To improve the model and make it more realistic to the experiments, I changed the zero pitch and roll assumption to allow small pitch and roll angles. Then we decoupled the motion into vertical and planar directions. We could write down the foot position in world frame as follows, and we will use these two equations to construct the model with two steps. The first step is to find which feet are in contact and their supporting forces. And the second step is to solve for the planar body velocities. So let me illustrate the model, the first step, using a 2D example where the robot can only pitch without roll. So we want to solve for the pitch and robot height at z-axis force balance and the moment balance about the axis that's perpendicular to the screen. We start with all feet in the air and gradually lowering the robot until some foot hits the ground and z-force balance is achieved. If only one foot is in contact, we rotate the body about the contacting foot until another one gets in contact. And then we use these two contact indices to formulate this equation. After solving for the pitch and robot height, we plug the solution back into the forces and check if the contact indices match as when we constructed the equations. If they match, then we return the solution. If they doesn't, we move in the state space towards that solution and stop immediately after the contact switching surface and then repeat to solve for the equations. This could be easily extended to 3D by adding the roll dimension in the search state, and there's one more torque balance equation to solve for that extra unknown. So after the first step, we know which foot are in contact and their supporting forces. Let's look at the planar motion. We have the foot position and velocities in the world frame, and the unknowns here are the theta dot turning velocity, the body turning velocity, and pxy0 dot, which is the body velocity in xy plane. We solved the unknowns by force and torque balance equations in the xy plane. For the friction model here, we consider the friction parameter h sub k times the sliding velocity, where h sub k is parametrized by the friction coefficient mu times the normal force, which is predicted from the first step, times epsilon plus v divided by epsilon plus v squared, where v of k here is the absolute value of the sliding velocity. Here, epsilon is an adjustable parameter to study different friction models in practice. When epsilon goes to 0, h of k gives the Coulomb friction parameters. And when epsilon goes to infinity, h of k gives the viscous Coulomb friction. And in this case, h sub k is independent of v sub k. So the friction forces is linear in terms of the sliding velocity and therefore linear in terms of the unknowns. Here we also allow friction anisotropy, where we use wk as an enhanced traction direction to change the circular friction cone into the ellipsoidal one. Then we tested the model on our big-end robot with force torque sensors that measuring the ground contact forces at each foot. The motion capture results are in red. The pitch rho are predicted from the spring model plotted in purple. We compared the body velocity prediction from Coulomb friction plotted in blue and Coulomb viscous friction plotted in orange. These two models gave predictions of comparable quality as their velocity signals overlapped. Because of the linearity in Coulomb viscous model, it computes 50 times faster than the Coulomb friction. In this tripod gate, there's about 20% of the motion is slipping. So to understand more about what's happening during slipping, we designed this metachrono gate to deliberately have the robot slip. It has 4 legs in contact with the ground at different velocities. So you can see from the video, the robot is slipping for almost all the time. We plotted the slipping velocity along the heading direction and the measured friction force divided by the supporting force. Not surprisingly, the friction is indeed Coulomb friction. And we're showing the forces in x, y, z direction normalized by the robot gravity. The force torque sensor measurements are plotted in red, Coulomb friction prediction in blue, and Coulomb viscous prediction in orange. The point of this plot is to show you that 3 signals overlaps on each other, which means both friction models are able to predict the actual friction forces. So getting all of these friction, the force torque measurements actually was quite challenging. And I will present the setup and calibration procedure of how to get these measurements in the next section. So far we have shown we're able to model the motion of big-end robot. To see if the model could work with other robots with different morphology, here I used a pre-existing multipod dataset. The robot legs were made from spring steels, and the robot was constructed with 3 degree of freedom modular segments. Each segment controls 1 pair of legs. In this dataset, the robot has 3 to 6 pair segments. I predicted the spring loading of the legs from the motion capture measurements and modeled the robot motion using the proposed model. We can see that the model gives a good prediction on the robot heading velocity, and most of the error occur on the side velocities. I will discuss how to improve this in a later section. So why do we want to construct this model totally from scratch instead of using some existed physics engine? Here we compared our model with Majoko, a commonly used robotics simulator, good for modeling complex contact-rich dynamics. We measured the computation time normalized by the 3-legged case, and then increased the number of legs up to 50. And our model plotted in blue only doubled the computation time when the leg reaches 50, whereas Majoko increased about 13 times. This suggests our model is more efficient with many legs. And furthermore, the model doesn't sacrifice accuracy for computation time. Here we compared 1 randomly selected big-end trajectory and use our model prediction in blue compared with Majoko simulation in orange and motion capture in red. To the best of our tuning effort in the Majoko parameters, we did not see Majoko overperform our model. The model parameters used in our model are just spring stiffness and friction coefficients of each leg. And because we're solving for the set of force-torque balance equations, the absolute magnitude of these parameters doesn't matter. Only the trade-offs among the legs matter. This makes the system identification problem even easier. So if all the legs are the same, like the multipod case, we could just use ones for all the parameters, and it worked well. The entire implementation of this model is less than 200 lines in Python with only NumPy dependency. This allows us to easily implement the model on GPU for parallelization, and I will talk about this in the last section. So finally, why does viscous Coulomb friction work in the force perspective? We studied the relative error of predicting Coulomb friction force using viscous Coulomb friction model around the normalized sliding velocity 1,0. Here we plotted the contour of relative error, and it showed that the force error is within 2% with a 20% change in the velocity. This suggests viscous Coulomb friction model is a good approximation of Coulomb friction if the sliding velocity does not fluctuate more than 20%. So in summary, in this section, we talked about the multi-legged locomotion model construction. The model matches well with experimental data in both kinematic and forces. The model generalized well with different gaits and different robots with different morphologies. The model scales well with an increasing number of legs. Next, I will talk about the robot setup and calibration for measuring the ground contact forces on each foot. So in the experiment, we used a modified design of the big end robot made by rapidly prototyping on foam core tapes, plastic boards, and ABS boards. It equips with 6 1-degree of freedom 4-bar linkage legs, and beneath each leg, there is an ATI force-torque sensor measuring all 6 components of force and torques between the leg and the chassis. The sensor has a pretty high resolution in 0.05 Newton. And by doing a transformation from the sensor frame to the tip of the foot, we can get the ground contact force for each individual leg. So this seemed to be a pretty simple task of getting accurate contact force measurements. However, when we only use the manufacturer's calibration matrix to transform the spring gauges into force and torques, we didn't get the measurement with expected accuracy. In the figure, we're showing the sensor measurement in the world frame vertical axis on a very slowly working gate. During each tripod touchdown, we're expected to see 2 square waves with the same magnitude on the left and right tripod. The total force plotted in green should stay around the chassis gravity in dashed red, but there's a 10 Newton offset and 3 Newton standard deviation. We also found large errors on the sum of all wrenches when robots standing at different poses. This caused the trouble for us to measure and analyze the friction. So we need to characterize where the errors come from and how to calibrate the sensors on the robot to improve the measurement accuracy. One possible error source is the sensor has a measurement offset. And from our observation, the offset drifts over time. It can drift 10 Newton for a 6-month period. And the manufacturer recommends us to send the sensor back for a recalibration at least once a year. But the process of remounting the sensor back onto the robot often leads to other miscalibration of the sensor like leg gravity or sensor misalignment during mounting. Other reasons like temperature or hysteresis could also affect the measurement. But in this work, we will focus on the first three error sources. We characterize a constant sensor offset, the mass of the leg, the center of mass of the leg as a function of the shaft angle, and a small transformation error that compensates the sensor axis misalignment during mounting. We estimated the first three sets of parameters by handing the robot in opposite directions. By adding and subtracting the sets of opposite measurements, we could get these parameters through several optimizations. For the transformation error, we have the robot standing at different poses and optimized towards zero total range. The calibration process brings down the total range residual from blue to green, which has a much smaller standard deviation centered around zero. After calibration, we measured the kinematic data from motion capture and ground contact wrenches at each foot when the robot running a tripod and metachronal gate. And we use this data set to validate our multi-legged locomotion model as presented in the previous section. We also made this data set open source together with the data processing and model implementation code. So a quick summary of this section, we recognize the error in force torque sensing. We presented the experimental setup, the calibration parameters and procedures. We also provided the open source data set for model validation. In the last section, I will present three preliminary projects in extending the model to slope and stairs, compensating sim to rail transfer errors, and using the model to do motion planning. We previously constructed the equation using the sum of the planar forces equal to zero and the vertical force equals to robot gravity. So to extend the model to slopes, we could simply decompose the gravity along and perpendicular to the slope and rotate the robot motion into these two directions. In the video here, we're showing a simulated trajectory of big end robot walking up a slope using the tripod gate plotted from the side view. The red is the robot center. Purple, orange, and blue are three left feet. The thinner lines represents the trajectory in the air, and the stars represents the contacting part. To extend the model onto stairs, we cannot simply do the rotation at the slopes because the stairs still provide supporting and vertical forces still providing supporting and frictional forces in the vertical and planar directions. We observed from experiments the robot had a pitch angle along the stairs and vary around that angle. So in the model, we changed the small angle approximation for pitch to allow it to vary around an initial pitch angle beta 0. Then the previously discussed algorithm still applies. In the video, we're showing a simulated trial, again, of big end robot running a tripod gate climbing upstairs. The toe position plotted in the video are the positions before the compression. So the amount that goes into the ground represents the compressed length of that leg. The next part is to extend our model with a residual term to compensate for unmodeled robot dynamics from data. In this plot, the model prediction in blue has a large error in predicting the side velocities, especially with increasing robot speed. So to improve our model, we added this constant B matrix as a residual term together with our model as the local connection. We fit B matrix through linear regression from robot data measured from motion capture. Here we can see the model prediction with the residual B plotted in orange improved the prediction a lot, especially on the side velocities with higher speed in these two plots. Then we ask, can this B matrix generalize among frequencies? Here we used a B matrix trained on the dataset contains only the motion at the lowest frequency, 0.3 Hz, and used that B as the residual term to predict the motion across all frequencies that goes up to 2.4 Hz. The velocity arrow is plotted in orange, and we compare it with B trained on its own frequency plotted in purple. The arrow without B is plotted in blue. Here we can see B matrix generalize well among frequencies as the purple and orange contour are almost the same. And they greatly reduce the side velocity arrow from blue. The last part is an application of our model in motion planning. Because of our model simplicity, we can easily parallelize the computation onto a GPU and do motion planning with it. For each time step, we gave each foot 4 velocity choices. Going backward, stay at current position, moving forward, or moving forward at a higher speed. So there's 4 to the power of 6, 9,096 possibilities. We computed all of them on GPU in parallel and take the one with the lowest error to the target motion. The planning algorithm only takes 1 second to compute a motion plan for 300 steps, so that's faster than the real motion. In the video, we're showing a robot running under a planned motion that commanded it to do a sharp turn. The motion is actually quite hard for an engineer to implement empirically because the robot needs to turn like a differential drive vehicle, but also needs to plan for which foot are in contact. So in summary of this entire thesis, here I presented an efficient method to model multi-legged locomotion with sloping. We motivate this model with an inchworm crawling model showing an averaged linear force velocity relationship like viscous friction under Coulomb friction sloping. We propose a fast algorithm to compute the body velocity and 3D contacting forces, together with experimental validation and open source implementation. We presented the experimental setup and calibration procedure to get accurate force torque sensing on each foot and collected open source datasets with robot running at 2 different gates. Finally, in the last section, we presented 3 preliminary projects to showcase how to use this model in applications. I hope this thesis could facilitate the usage of multi-legged robots as they're stable, cheap, and easy to model. For future work, we could optimize the GPU implementation and plan the robot motion with higher level task planner, like finding a path for the robot to go from the building entrance to the 3rd floor coffee room, together with a lower level gate planner that could optimize the gate while the robot climbing upstairs. The model could also be integrated with sensoring and filtering scheme to get more robust and accurate state estimation. Additionally, the model parameters could be converted to slowly varying online parameters, so we could adaptively tune these parameters with sensor observations. Finally, since the model evaluation is quite fast with a small sim to real transformation gap, the model could facilitate reinforcement learning community in getting optimal policies on multi-legged robots. Another direction for future work is to relax our principally kinematic assumption, where we assume this momentum p term here is always 0. Previous work has studied a data-driven method to construct local connection with an extension to quickly decaying momentum case. Future study could study what is a good representation of the momentum in physical modeling perspective and incorporate the shape dynamics into the equation of motion. These are the publications over the years, and that's the end of the technical part of the presentation. Let's come to the acknowledgement. So I would like to first thank my advisor. I would like to express my deepest appreciation to you, Professor Rabden. I joined the lab since I was an undergrad during the junior year, and you triggered my interest in studying robotics, math, stats, and biomechanics through your breadth of knowledge. And I am really lucky to have you as my advisor. I would also like to thank my committee members, Dr. Ghaffari, Dr. Moore, Dr. Gregg, for serving on my committee and giving me great suggestions during the thesis proposal, reading my thesis and giving me feedbacks. And also thank Mani for joining the defense on the other side of the world. I would also like to thank my lab mates from Birds Lab. It was my great pleasure to work with all of you. Especially, I would like to thank Dan Zhao for introducing me to the lab when I was an undergrad and helped me to get started with my first project. I would also like to thank two undergrads, Shuyu and Advit, for their help in GPU coding. I would like to thank Mariam for taking care of all the electronics in the lab. I would like to thank Daphne, Nick, Leo, Kayla for taking care of cockroaches and doing the experiments. I would also like to thank our lab pest cockroaches for their contributions to the science, even though they're not cooperative enough to give me a large data set to analyze yet. I hope this could be done in the future. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge my family and friends. I'd like to thank my parents who also joined us on Zoom. I'd like to thank them for their love, support, and encouragement that leading me to the place where I am. My parents and I, together with my cousin Xiangxin and my little niece Anya, have a weekly family meeting that is written on my calendar, and that is very relaxing and entertaining for the week. Next, I would like to thank my friends from the department, especially the Wire Plus community, Women in Robotics and Engineering community, where I got a lot of fun activities and support. Then I would like to acknowledge my friend Menchil. We were friends since middle school and roommates for 4 years in the college. I would like to thank her for always being there, available to chat. Finally, I would like to thank my boyfriend, Rowan, for always believing in my ability more than I do, and thank him for the support, especially over these 2 months after he defended. And that's all for the presentation. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.